side, 3.
I now had a credit balance at the bank, which in those days was doubly creditable. It went to my head. I announced to Edith we had to move to the country, perhaps near Pinewood, where we could be amongst the elite. We could even join the merry-go-round, which I'd been so much against not long before, and the air would be good for the children. Edith objected. The house we had was more than adequate. It was delightful, and moreover, it was paid for. Of course, if I'd been honest, I would have admitted to her that the whole crazy idea was simply me trying to prove that I was capable of making decisions for my own family. I was adamant. We moved to the country, to Lavender Lodge down by the river at Maidenhead. I bought it with a heavy mortgage from a member of the Poupar family, the famous jam makers, whose fortune, I'm sure, gave their lifestyle a certain consistency, which could hardly be said of my source of income. But there was no doubt the house was near Pinewood Studios. However, I have to admit that during our 3 or 4 years in residence, I never had one call to appear in a film there. My life as a country gent began well, coinciding with the offer in 1954 of a leading role in Basil Dearden's new film, The Rainbow Jacket, a tale of the sport of kings involving a bent bookmaker and a band jockey who still hangs around the racetracks. The jockey strikes up a father-figure relationship with a young lad who aspires to wear the colours, and when he does, is prepared to pull the race to save his friend from the mob. The script, sympathetically and gently written, came from the pen of T.B. Clarke, and it proved a very successful film. The young lad was played by an unknown fella Edmonds, who after his brief moment of glory seemed to disappear back into the unknown. My girlfriend was played by Kay Walsh. Other stalwarts included Sid James, Bernard Lee, and Edward Underdown, while 2 jockey club stewards were played by Wilfred Hyde-White and Robert Morley, who, both being regular punters, seemed to write their own script as they went along. Sir Gordon Richards made a guest appearance, and many years later, Willie Carson, giving a TV interview, said it was seeing the film as a schoolboy that had made him determined to become a jockey. The Rainbow Jacket was made at Ealing Studios under the flag of Sir Michael Balcon. The preparation prior to the making of the film included working with an animal for which I have no particular love, the horse. The Acton Robothams, I'm the first to admit, do not come from an equestrian background. My learning experience was arduous, somewhat dangerous, and downright painful. My first morning out was taken under the watchful eye of a Mr. Smith of Holyport, an instructor with royal connections, I was told. He had me jogging bareback around the paddock. Of course, I was totally unprepared for this and wore no protection whatsoever. Without going into the details, I am sure even the ladies will appreciate my predicament as matters almost came to the crunch. Then, damn me, only a few weeks later, on location at Kempton, if another of these temperamental brutes didn't kick me in the same place. Edith happened to be with me that day, so at least I didn't have to explain the bruises. But she did show some concern as I stood there clasping my breeches, inquiring of Sir Michael Balcon, "He isn't damaged, is he?" It was during the making of the film that I learned of the death of my father, a loss which affected Edith almost as much as it did me. They had grown very close during our marriage. This, I believe, was due to his sympathy, understanding, and affection for her, qualities that had been missing in the relationship she had with her own father. The emotions were there, of course, but hidden. It was pitiful to watch the frustration of both as Edith and her father tried to communicate. But old Tom could only find expression through material things. Another reason for my father's fondness for Edith was the grandson she had presented him with, whom he adored. My father had been treated for a chest cold when in fact he was suffering from pneumonia. He had been the union delegate for the Hanwell trolleybus depot, which may have given him sufficient importance to explain the presence of 2 officials from the London Passenger Transport Board. They, with great ceremony, presented my mother with a certificate and a cheque for £50. Was this then the sum total of his worth after a lifetime of labour and 2 wars? Dylan Thomas raged at the death of his father. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Well, my dear father did all his burning and raving when he was alive, on behalf of his fellow man. Meanwhile, back at Lavender Lodge, the landed gentry scene, with country life, house and garden left casually on coffee tables, was really not for me. I had to face the fact that as a good jobbing actor, I was never going to be able to keep a show like this on the road. Now, if I had been sensible and become a jam maker like the previous owners, who knows, Edith and I might have lived happily ever after. By the time I was making The Ship That Died of Shame for Basil Dearden from the novel by Nicholas Montserrat, we had moved to Brighton, an upheaval I missed as I was busy with Richard Attenborough and George Baker chasing up and down the English Channel in a motor torpedo boat. I became very attached to Brighton. I felt safe there, and yet it was to prove a place of momentous changes in my life. The first time I met Oscar Lowenstein was with Lord Willis when they set up a professional company at Unity Theatre in the late 1940s, from which I absolved myself of any responsibility, simply because I didn't consider it to be a viable proposition. I was proved right. The second time Oscar and I met, he had become a respected impresario who, with his company Peacham Productions, was about to present the British premiere of the Threepenny Opera, book and lyrics by Bertolt Brecht, music by Kurt Weill, and he was offering me the leading role as Mac the Knife. What a part! What a gift of a role! Well, it certainly turned out to be under Sam Wanamaker's direction, and one of the most exciting theatrical experiences of my life. I shall always remember the gathering for the first rehearsal. Georgia Brown, Daphne Anderson, Warren Mitchell, and Eric Pohlman, to mention just a few of the large company. And what a first night! The Royal Court Theatre was packed with everybody who was anybody in showbiz, including the dilettantes. During the interval, Claude Coburn, the well-known Irish journalist, whom I'd never met before in my life, found his way into my dressing room, spewed into the sink, congratulated me, and then left. After all the clamour, Edith and I had a quiet supper with Kitty and Malcolm Muggeridge, staying the night with them at their flat in the Albany, off Piccadilly. The next day, to celebrate my notice by Robert Raitt in The Star, a brilliant Mac the Knife, Edith bought me a new cap from Locks in St. James. I normally bought mine from Dunn's. Tommy was now at prep school and I missed him. He and I have always been great friends, a relationship that began to blossom the morning I arrived back from America. I've always felt an affinity between us. As mates, we still enjoy each other's company. I can't ever recall the need to lay down any hard and fast rules, although there was one occasion when I caught him out in some half-truth, and I warned him that he must never tell me a lie again. Then, after second thoughts, I added, if you can avoid it. Well, I reasoned even at the age of 5 he needs a little elbow room in which to maneuver, bearing in mind the world he would have to grow up in. Gradually, in spite of my preaching to Edith my long-held belief of equal rights for all, a doctrine she had paid lip service to, agreeing out of her love for me, I seemed to be undergoing a kind of metamorphosis, reluctantly acceding to her preconceived notions of what our lifestyle should be. I can even remember hearing myself say at one of our cocktail parties, We've got Tommy down for lancing, you know. I think I was, for the first and last time, trying to rid myself of the chains that bind my socialist principles. Don't misunderstand me, there's nothing wrong with that, if one is honest and convinced. But I was becoming neither, and in consequence began to lose my own identity. I had a telephone call from Peter Rogers, brother-in-law of Sidney Box, the man who had sufficient faith in me to put me under contract with Rank. It was Peter who had written the screenplay for When the Bow Breaks. Now, some 10 years later, he wanted to know if I would like to be in a film he was producing called Carry On Sergeant. I played the corporal, and the sergeant was played by William Hartnell. When asked what I thought the chances of the film were, I admitted to some doubt. My reasoning was that by the late 50s, the British cinema-going public were watching high-quality, sophisticated movies, such as Room at the Top, The Old Man and the Sea, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, to mention just a few. And I wondered what, in 1958, their reaction would be to a low-budget army knockabout comedy in black and white. Little did I or any of the actors in Carry On Sergeant realize that we were in at the birth of what was to become a landmark in the history of British film comedy. And now, with their continuous showing on television, they're an institution. When David King, the leader of New Haven Boys Club in Sussex, asked me to open their annual summer fete, I agreed to meet him and immediately felt a bond. I learned later his marriage was also falling apart. Perhaps this had been part of the mutual and instant empathy between us. But whatever the reason, our meeting began a friendship that has lasted more than 30 years. He has since retired to the country, but still comes up to London occasionally, where we have lunch and talk about times past and my continuing involvement in boys' clubs, for which I received the MBE in 1976. Beyond my political involvement with the Labour Party and the never-ending round of opening one function or another, I had never felt the need to ally myself with a particular charity, as have many showbiz personalities. But my first visit to a boys' club changed all that. I was instantly hooked. The boys were from a similar background to mine. I could identify with and relate to them. Because this new association caused such a change in my life, I think I should explain a little of my early involvement. It all began with gentle and careful persuasion from David. First, I became president of the club. Then he arranged for me to talk to the boys about theatre and acting, which as far as they were concerned was a foreign subject and not regarded by the majority of them as an asset to their macho image. The problem was how to hold their interest and enthusiasm and at the same time rid them of any self-consciousness. Educationally, they were mainly in the C stream, and their individual club membership span had an average of 2 years, so there was no time to attempt either theory or improvisation. I had to find a play that obeyed the rules that, as I saw them, were essential. Immediate identification with the characters, whatever the situation. The same with the pattern of dialogue, fast action and no longer than half an hour, and also allowing for non-speaking parts. It was the director of the National Youth Theatre who advised me, "You want plays like that, Bill, you will have to sit down and write them," which is what I did and still do. With all my years of experience working in boys' clubs around the country, trying to improve the value of the performing arts, there can be no doubt that my greatest rewards and satisfaction came with the boys at New Haven. But this is quite understandable. It was where it all began. The ideas, the experimentation, the theories and the plays. I held sessions trying to explain how I was trying to make them act. Yes, they got bored sometimes, but they never lost the excitement of trying to put the pieces together and making them work. And behind all of this was the belief and dedication of David King, supporting me in what I was trying to achieve. By the time I came back to live in London in 1963, I was totally involved, having written a number of short plays and pamphlets expounding my theories and experience of drama in boys' clubs. I was asked by the National Association of Boys' Clubs to chair a panel of enthusiasts involved in this activity, and I also toured the country giving classes whenever time permitted, as I still do. Edith and I had been living in Brighton for about 5 years, successfully acting out a reputation in the incestuous little social whirl as the hosts with the most on the ball. But with the departure of the last guest, we took off our masks. The farce was over, and in silence I would empty the ashtrays and Edith would go to her room. Edith suddenly suggested we move house, and I have never been sure why. Was it a last desperate attempt to save our marriage, which had been faltering for longer than I now care to remember? But whatever the reason, I refused to entertain the idea. Nevertheless, she simply went out one morning and bought a large Regency house in nearby Lewis Crescent. It was an awe-inspiring residence with the ground floor and basement converted into separate apartments. Eventually, of course, I moved, despite my unheeded protestations. By now, I was accustomed to going with the flow, and any so-called resolution on my part soon crumbled. With the exception of a small flat on the top floor, which had been reserved for the housekeeper, the rest was home. So a kind of peace settled between us for a while. Edith was to find a great contentment in slowly returning her new home to its former glory. She indulged herself to the full, furnishings, fabrics, and antiques, each room taking on its own particular Regency grandeur. The result was magnificent, and she was deservedly proud of her accomplishment. Every acquisition became the topic for much speculation and admiration, each a conversation piece in our little social world. For example, the hanging of a Dresden chandelier in the sitting room brought about what can only be described as an upper-class Tupperware party. The sound of popping champagne corks replacing the bubbling noise of percolating coffee. In the meantime, I had found refuge in a little room I discovered in the basement. This I used as an office and study where I settled to outdo Chekhov, Ibsen, or even Philip King, the most modest playwright I ever met. It was at one of our obligatory Brighton social gatherings that I was introduced to Charles Rogers, a BBC opera producer, who asked if I would be interested in playing Coco in a Sadler's Wells opera production of The Mikado. Without disclosing the fact that I had never seen or heard a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, I immediately expressed an interest. An appointment was made at Sadler's Wells to meet the director. I gave my audition and sang Titwillow, which seemed to go down quite well. The big boss laughed. It was supposed to be a sad little song. In the early hours of the day of the London opening, I was informed by telephone of my mother's death. I went to her as quickly as I could, and with the help of neighbours and the doctor, managed to attend to all those sad but necessary details that we all have to face at some time or other in our lives. I hadn't seen my father when he was dead, and the doctor seemed somewhat bewildered when I refused an invitation to disturb the peace of that darkened front room where my mother lay at rest. I rang Sadler's Wells and explained that under the circumstances I would be unable to make the dress rehearsal. They were very kind, suggesting that the understudy was quite adequate if I preferred not to play the opening. After all, was it right that a loving son should be clowning on stage trying to make people laugh at such a time? But what else could I do? I had nowhere else to go. Following an otherwise happy time with Sadler's Wells, I was asked to partner Sid James in a new BBC TV series, Taxi, by Lord Willis, which concerned the adventures of a London cab and its joint owners. It also included an up-and-coming young actor by the name of Ray Brooks. It was a 13-part series which necessitated my staying in London. Well, that was my excuse. I would stay in town Monday to Friday and go back to Brighton at weekends. One Monday morning at Brighton Station, I met Nina, a company secretary, also going to work in London. We spoke as we waited for the train, and so our relationship began. I was divorced by Edith after 18 years of marriage. Our parting was inevitable. We had become almost like strangers. I remember on our way to some social occasion, she broke our usual silence, saying, "Say something to me, Bill." It was almost as if she were pleading with me, and all I could reply was, "I can't think of anything to say." And I meant it. I duly removed myself and my few belongings from our museum of a house, and I recall being back in London looking at the small pile of personal belongings in my room, books, records, clothes, typewriter, etc., and reflecting that this was the sum total of my effects when I got married. What had happened in between? The only stake I could claim was that of father to our son, and I would probably lose him with a divorce. Where does all the love go? So there I was, a divorce on my hands and nowhere to live. I've had better scenarios. But Nina accepted it all with her quiet enthusiasm, something I have to admit I didn't share at the time. But that was the great thing about her. She had this almost chameleon-like quality of being able to adapt to any circumstance. For example, for one who was not involved with the theatre until she met me, she became not only an enthusiastic playgoer, but was immediately at ease in the company of actors and a perfect audience for all their off-stage performances. One day, Jack Grossman, a filmmaker and writer whom I had met when we worked together on a fringe production of Whiten Your Fanlight, a quote from a government pamphlet on protection against the atom bomb, phoned offering me a couple of days' work on a documentary he was making. There was something else. He'd heard that Nina and I had to get out of a room in Upper Wimpole Street where we'd been lodging, and he offered us the temporary use of a put-you-up settee in his Kilburn flat. A friend in need is a friend indeed under any circumstances. It was a large flat. It needed to be. Jack's wife Vera was enormous with child, besides which they were also sheltering Cathy O'Donoghue, another orphan from another collapsed marriage. If you wanted privacy, you went to bed, but even Nina and I were able to postpone that temptation in order to enjoy the ritual of the evening meal, when we all gathered around the kitchen table and exchanged the day's happenings over fish and chips or Chinese takeaway, washed down with cheap plonk. 5 people living on top of one another, in harmony and sharing so much laughter. The relationship between actor and agent depends on just how much work the agent can get for his client. I have never liked changing agents. I find it embarrassing and with no guarantees as to its effectiveness. Such changes have been rare in my life, but I have to admit that around the early 60s I found myself blessed with one who was seldom available after lunch, since he was thereafter closeted at his club or in some consultation with his bookmaker. Thus I felt the time had come for a change and rang Michael Sullivan. Michael was a variety agent with aspirations for having legitimate clients. I became his first and, to my knowledge, only actor on his books. We had met socially, he was quite a fan, and he had already broached the subject of representing me. When I say he was a fan, I'm not kidding. At social gatherings, interviews with impresarios, wherever and to whomsoever, He would announce, "Don't worry about Bill, he can act anything." He was a good friend and a hustler. I have never met anyone in my life who had so much faith in me. The 60s saw in the Beatles, flower power, sexual equality, and my divorce. Quite rightly, Edith had been given custody of Tom, who was by now a young teenager at Lancing College, and sensitive to the closeness of my relationship with him, she readily agreed to any reasonable arrangements for access that I cared to make. Nina and I were now living in a flat in Marital High Street, where, for propriety's sake, we had all agreed Tom could visit but not stay overnight. Inevitably, that rule went the way of so many in life, and along with that came my son's declaration that he no longer wanted to live with Edith, he wanted to stay with us. And what's more, as if the cat wasn't already amongst the pigeons, he stated that he didn't want to stay on at Lancing. To put it mildly, these were added problems I could have well done without. Wounds that had hardly had time to heal were sure to be opened again, and they were. I eventually had to phone Edith, and to say she was shocked would be an understatement. She'd had no intimation whatsoever of Tom's feelings or intentions. When she asked to speak to him, he refused. So I became the culprit, and curses and accusations were rained upon my head. A very chastened offspring was sent to bed with the order, "Get your ass back to Lancing tomorrow morning, smartish, and tell your headmaster I'll be phoning. Good night." Nina began to weep. I opened a bottle. In 1969, Nina and I said farewell. She was not prepared to go on suffering and living with the ghosts of my previous marriage, a view with which I fully sympathized. We parted friends. In fact, 1 year later, when in the small hours of the morning she phoned extremely distressed, having just been told that her boyfriend had been killed in a road accident, I immediately went to her. It would take a greater pen than mine to summarize here my relationship with Nina. Were too many highs followed by too many lows? We both tried, but she tried harder and kept trying until it was all too much. As a lover, she was everything to me. No boundaries existed for her. She simply sought the unselfish pursuit of shared joy. And when I became ungrateful, she walked away, as well she might. There had been much suffering in her life in the name of love, but she would never lose faith. She was a survivor. Tom had left Lancing, and as he was too young for drama school, I subsidized him as a student actor at Leatherhead Theatre, where he stayed until he attended an audition for a children's TV series, Wreckers at Deadeye. He played a leading role, from which followed 2 other junior series, Freewheelers and Tottering Towers. These were followed by several film parts, the best being in Goodbye, Mr. Chips. It was all happening, but it put paid to any ideas I had about an academic training for him. At the age of 18, he was independent, shared a flat, rather tatty, owned his own car, very tatty, and was doing what he wanted to do. When I questioned him about it, he replied, "What academic training did you have?" It was in 1969 that I met Lindsay Anderson. I was being interviewed for a part in a new David Story play, In Celebration, and Lindsay was to direct it at the Royal Court Theatre in Sloane Square. I remember him putting me at my ease on what was a very cold morning by discussing the merits of long underwear. Having got that out of the way, he then asked me to read from the play, which is the story of the Shaw family, including the father, an old Yorkshire miner, and I had to admit I had never played a Yorkshire part before. Some actors specialize in dialects, but I've always settled for giving an impression, picking key words, making the right sound. Lindsay made no comment when I finished. He just thanked me and we said goodbye. I stood outside the royal court, and somehow it seemed colder than when I'd gone in. I was sure that was one audition I'd failed, and I duly informed my agent. However, he phoned me the next day to tell me otherwise. Mr. Anderson was offering me the part of Old Shaw, the Yorkshire miner. This was to be the beginning of an association and friendship which lasted until his recent death. Our theatre work together, though sparse, includes 3 plays by David Storey, In Celebration, The Contractor, and The March on Russia, retitled Jubilee for the tour in 1990. And they have provided me with 3 of the most effective roles of my career. So there I was, about to meet a company of actors, none of whom I had met before. Constance Chapman played Mrs. Shaw, Alan Bates, Brian Cox, and Jimmy Bolam, our sons, with Gabriel Drake and Fulton Mackay as family friends. Lindsay's original intention was to cast the play with northern actors. However, he ended up with a very mixed bunch, but admitted after a week's rehearsal to feeling very confident. The play opened on the 22nd of April 1969 to rave reviews for all concerned, and I received my first fan letter from another actor. It came from Donald Sinden, and I kept it. My dear Bill, very, very seldom is one privileged to see such a beautiful performance as yours in Celebration. It is so much easier to portray evil than good. A bitchy note is so much easier than a laudatory one. I sat there the other week at the Thursday matinee, entranced by your beautiful observation of the father. Good God, I'd met him. I must have done. How many times have I seen true goodness portrayed? Pierre Fresnay in Monsieur Visson, Rému in Fanny, Richard Burton in The Boy with the Cart, and Bill Owen twice in this current play, and one in the war, or just afterwards, at the Theatre Royal Brighton. But what was the name of the play? You were playing a very simple youth. How do you do it? 10 out of 10, Mr. Owen, straight to the top of my list of favourite actors. There are so many details I would love to mention, but if you are anything like me, you would never do them again, so I will just retain them glowing in my memory. Congratulations, Donald. The greatest thing for me about In Celebration was the feeling of being totally fulfilled as an actor, something I hadn't experienced in many years. It had been a long time since the members of the Broken Marriages Club had sat down to eat at the Grossmans, but it was there that Cathy O'Donoghue and I met up again. And so we were married. And we've jogged along for over 20 years or more now. We don't gallop as often as we used to, but I'm a bit short of wind these days. My actor's instinct was immediately alerted by a script headed Pilot Script Last of the Summer Wine by Roy Clark. I read it, then picked up the phone and rang Jimmy Gilbert at the BBC to tell him I would be delighted to accept the role of Compo in Last of the Summer Wine for Comedy Playhouse. My instinct told me I had just read something unique in the annals of television comedy. At our first meeting with the author, the 3 of us, Michael Bates, Peter Sallis and myself, expressed doubts about the title of the show, which we felt was too long and difficult to remember. Although I heard a delightful variation on this theme when one of our studio technicians told me about his mother-in-law who, despite his constant explanations that Last of the Summer Wine was the title, still announced to all and sundry that "You'd better come and watch Summer Wine tonight, 'cause it's the last one." It was 24 years ago when we trundled off to Yorkshire for the pilot film location, and I'm pretty sure that the title presents no difficulty for our millions of viewers now. But there's always an exception, like the taxi driver last week who said, "Here, hang on, you're in that port wine, ain't you?" The subject of clothes we were to wear came up at the meeting. We all finally agreed there should be one basic costume for each character. Blaymeyer, Michael Bates, in the nondescript suit, raincoat and trilby hat. Clegg, Peter Sallis, in Peter's old demob suit, plastic back and cap. Compo's costume was discussed after lunch, during which the wine had flowed freely. This may well account for the composite, forgive the pun, and resulting impression of total dereliction, which, during the first 4 series, I was able to perfect into one of the most identifiable costumes on British television. Until it came to making the pilot for Comedy Playhouse, a visit to Yorkshire as an actor meant normally a week in Leeds, Bradford or Hull, cities through touring with plays I knew very well by the early 70s. Such trips would of necessity include finding the best digs, the location of the theatre and the pub nearest to the stage door, and it was most unlikely that I would venture beyond these safe havens. So, travelling now along the highways and byways of the West Riding was like journeying into the unknown. 5 miles along the Huddersfield Road, going towards Holme Moss, and suddenly, there it was, Holmfirth. A little town looking, I thought, rather down on its uppers, due no doubt to the fact that most of the mills in the valley were closed. The recession had been around a long time in Yorkshire. But it was a place with which I felt an immediate affinity. We used the Elephant and Castle at the end of Hollowgate as our location base, and as I sat at the bar, supping a half-pint, I had the growing feeling that I'd been here before. 20-odd years later, that feeling of déjà vu has been transformed into one of knowing I am at home in Holmfirth, and where I will no doubt find a final resting place. Memories of the earlier series are, I'm afraid, somewhat vague. Quite clear in my mind, however, is the memory of one of the original members of our terrible trio, Blaymeyer, played by the still-mourned Michael Bates. When we first met, we were strangers as people and as actors, never having worked together before. But it is part of the thespian nature, on meeting for the first time, mentally to walk around one another, sizing each other up, as it were. Following that meeting, joined by Roy Clark, we found ourselves thrown together in a pub-cum-hotel near Marsden in preparation for filming on location. Dinner time approached, and we, now joined by Jimmy Gilbert, settled to drinks in the bar before going to our table. Cards were being played very close to our chests. There was much mild banter, lubricated with not-so-mild whiskies. Dinner followed, eaten with much good red wine. Suddenly, the most violent argument arose between Michael and me. Politics, of course, and fueled by the Nuit Saint-Georges, Jimmy was trying to act as mediator. Not too successfully, and not without a look of foreboding as he beheld 2 of his leading actors at it hammer and tongs even before a camera had rolled. But just as events seemed to be leading to a punch-up, Michael rose to his feet and said, "Good night," and went to bed. We never had a crossword again. We became good friends, and with our wives shared many a social occasion. My friends will be amazed to have me admit that I'm not the most orderly and diplomatic participant in discussion. But it was Michael's bloody-minded and forthright refusal to come to terms, or even consider my point of view, that got me going. The following morning, about to start filming in a field with a herd of cows, actors rehearsed and ready to commence, I halted the proceedings with the question, "Who's going to tread in the cowpat?" Michael immediately replied, "I thought I would do that." "Good," I said, "as long as we know." "Okay, Jimmy." Jimmy closed the subject with, "Well, there's no point in 3 of you doing it." I believe that moment established a degree of professional honesty, trust and respect between the 3 leading actors, which has been the basis for our successful ensemble playing ever since. Being able now, thanks to the video, to view those early series, I can see how the pattern of the relationships has changed. The stories at the beginning, for instance, were almost entirely centered around the antics of Blamire, Compo and Clegg, but later other classic relationships were added. The first I recall, at the beginning of the series, was that between a sex-mad librarian, Blake Butler, who was continually pulling his innocent female assistant, Rosemary Martin, down behind the counter where one assumed they stamped each other's cards, or he updated her catalogue. Marital relations have always been a serious subject in Summer Wine. Journeys charted on stormy seas of suspicion, non-communication and sex, which, for the husbands, was lust for the other woman. Pigeons, the internal combustion engine, bachelordom, or to punch a certain bus conductress's ticket. For the wives, it was one of those things to be endured, but at least it gave them a chance to look for any damp patches on the ceiling. The 2 supreme examples were Sid and Ivy, John Comer and Jay Freeman, who, as they served tea and buns, hot pies and mushy peas, were likely suddenly to burst into a vehement argument regarding certain intimacies of their relationship, much to the amusement and interest of we 3. The other rigid partnership was that of Nora and Wally, Kathy Staff and Joe Gladwin, though of a different nature. There was never any argument, just commands from Nora, which Wally timorously obeyed, escaping when he could to the comfort and company of his pigeons. He would also gather a certain strength from his neighbour and friend, Compo Simonite, who might brazenly suggest, "Don't forget me, Wally. If thou gets fed up with her, send her round, I'll have her." And Nora would reply, "Are you going to stand there and let him talk like that about me?" And Wally would reply, "Aye, it's a fair offer. I could consider it." Then almost within a year of each other, John and Joe passed over, and suddenly there were 2 widows. Whilst those hilarious picnic conversations with the motorbike can never be replaced, Nora at least has had this scruffy would-be Lothario living next door to her, who gloats through the curtains as she hangs her very large smalls on the line. But I do think it's a pity that Ivy has not been paired off again. She has so much to offer, in every way. Think of what she might do for Smiler. Of course, one could say, depending on the circumstances, that the relationship between Compo and Nora Batty might be regarded as one of the classic love stories, vying with Romeo and Juliet, Antony and Cleopatra, or even Michael Jackson and his missus. When Nora looks into Compo's bloodshot eyes, something spiritual happens. His wellies steam up. 'Tis rumoured that he has to put them out at night, and they have been seen strolling around the town on their own, with the Home Firth sanitary inspector in hot pursuit. Like Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, they have been pursued by scandal and the tabloid press, hoping to catch them both as Compo grabs Nora by the bookmakers and she wallops him with her handbag. Sensational headlines. Does Compo get his rompo? Some blame must be laid at Terry Wogan's door when, over 20 years ago, he used to give daily reports on their derring do's on his morning radio show. But true love is still a rocky road, and Compo has the bruises to prove it. Nora wields a mean broom. The truth of it all is, of course, that it's all Compo's fantasy. Just dreams in the head, and certainly nothing below the non-existent belt.
That's the end of Side 3.